Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Schaus coming to you live from Washington, D.C., and thanks for joining us today in our Webinar Wednesday series. Every Wednesday, we host webinars. They are all complimentary and all recorded. You can find the recordings on our website and on our YouTube channel, and the full schedule is listed on our website. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, but our speakers' contact information will be posted on the last slide. And so if you have questions today about category management, you can contact Anne Laurent, who is our speaker today, at the end of the webinar. A little bit about us before we get started. We do provide professional services for government contractors. This includes GSA schedule help, contract administration, marketing, and business development. We hope that if you do have any questions, you can find more information about us on our website. Some upcoming events: we have a class on teaming and partnering, which is October 24th. And then in December, we have the 4th annual Doing Business with DoD and the Intel Community. Both of these are listed on our website under the event section. We do offer advertising in our newsletter, which reaches almost 16,000 government contractor and government subscribers. You can get details by emailing us at the address listed there. Okay, let's start digging into today's topic, which is category management, and our speaker is Anne Laurent. Her background information is listed here, which includes her education, her company, and her 30 years of experience in federal government contracting. Anne, we're very excited to have you with us today, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks a bunch, Jennifer. Hi, everybody, from steamy Washington, D.C. That picture there on the left of Washington traffic makes me really tense and nervous because I've spent many years in it. So I'm going to ask you to advance the slide, Jennifer, if you would. So hi, everybody. I'm going to talk to you today about category management. Yes, I am. However, the category management basics that I'm going to discuss today are not necessarily the category management basics that you might be accustomed to in the federal arena right now. The reason for that is that what informs my thinking and experience in category management, particularly public sector category management, is primarily the experience of having studied and worked with folks in the United Kingdom and looked at their program, which is about 10 or 11, going on 11 years old now, older than ours, and approaches category management in slightly different ways, I think, than the GSA OMB run government-wide category management program here. So you'll hear some things that are perhaps different from what you have been hearing, and you will also be hearing the way that the United States Air Force is approaching category management. While they are, of course, following the government-wide program, they're also going deeper and longer, I would say, than the government-wide program does go. So for me, for the UK and for the Air Force particularly, category management is an approach and a methodology that seeks savings and value, okay? And that's beyond just driving spending through specific contracts, in this case, the best-in-class contracts of the government-wide program. In fact, as you'll hear as we go on, spending actually isn't the focus, nor are contracts the focus of this kind of category management. So we're focusing here on demand management, on requirements, not specifically on contracts. You know, this kind of category management, this focus on category management, primarily looks to achieve an end to unnecessary, ill-advised spending. And the focus of it is not so much on the same old way that we look at budget execution, right? Let's spend our money out by the end of the fiscal. By the way, happy fiscal new year. But it looks to manage cost. And it looks to drive efficiencies by leveraging rate, which is the unit pricing, process, which can be anything from overhead to policies, to starting new policies, to ending policies, and demand, which is to managing requirements. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we know that category management covers common goods and services spending. That's about $300 billion annually. That's about half of total annual government procurement, by the way. So we're not talking about an insignificant amount of spend here. What we are looking at here through this lens is that the inefficiencies in that spend are caused by inadequate understanding of the market, those problems with requirements that I've been talking about, and unnecessary variation in price and scope in spending all the way across the enterprise, the government-wide spend, in other words. Next. So we are not exclusive, as you heard earlier, in applying category management government-wide. The UK has done it, New Zealand's done it, a number of different governments around the world have done it. Public sector category management is different from private sector category management. The scope alone is much, much larger. The complexity of spend is much larger. And the diversity among organizations and the orientation of those organizations towards their own mission and goals, rather than necessarily towards a larger mission and set of goals for procurement, also differs, because within a company, of course, everybody is oriented to the same set of business goals, which primarily drive down to profit. We don't have that measure in government, and it makes things more difficult for us in managing spending. So that's just important to remember. The way that public sector category management works is that government is trying very much to use it to be smarter buyers and to buy as single enterprises, the way that those companies I was just talking about do. So the idea here is to eliminate redundancies, eliminate duplication, and increase efficiency to drive better value through procurement. So the basic steps: identify core areas of spend, and then within those core areas of spend, you really do need to target which categories you're going to focus on for management. It also involves sharing expertise in managing spending and in business and market intelligence and in strategic sourcing across the whole enterprise. We do that by leveraging shared best practices, and we provide acquisition, supply, and demand solutions across the enterprise. Next. So we're talking here about something that is a very structured, very methodical approach, and it relies primarily on managing data. It should be, each category of spending should be managed by a category management team, and in the approach that I'm talking about, particularly through the Air Force, the belief is that cost management authority and the responsibility for managing category teams should be assigned to functional domain experts. That would be program side folks, rather than the procurement side folks. These teams should always have contracting officers and people with procurement expertise on them, but it should be the domain experts who should be managing categories, because they need the authority to actually affect demand, change demand. And we'll talk more about that in a second. One of the key elements of the Air Force program that is distinguishing it right now across as the leader of category management across the Defense Department is that they have a very comprehensive, robust business market intelligence process. And their focus, as the focus is in the UK, as the focus is primarily in the companies that manage themselves using category management, is to reduce the total cost of ownership. We are not focused in category management on prices. We are focused on total cost over time and managing that by managing the requirements process primarily. So again, I'm not talking much about contracts, and you'll notice that throughout. Next slide, please. So a key element of the UK program and of the Air Force program is that they understand category management to be market facing. That is to say, the thinking behind that is, look, if we're going to manage categories of spending, we're spending in markets with suppliers. So focusing internally on the belly button of our practices and our regulations, in other words, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and enforcing it, really weakens our ability to get value from our spending, because we're not focused on where the spending is going and how those suppliers operate within the markets within which they're buying and selling. Government is not the only customer of any of its suppliers, just about. And because of that, we in government need to turn our focus away from inside the government and out towards the market and how it functions, so we can take advantage of that knowledge to drive more value, to better manage suppliers, to better our relationships with those suppliers, to understand where in the market to buy and what the various different incentives are and operational methodologies are within the market. We're not talking here with category management just about procurement at all. If you look to the right, you'll see a graphic that I had prepared for a report that I wrote about the UK's category management program. And it's called Buying as One. Again, the focus on aggregating our knowledge, bringing together our understanding of our spending, and then going to the market as one buyer, not a panoply of agencies and sub-agencies in the federal market, but one buyer, the federal government. If you look to the right again, you'll see the way that the UK especially approaches this from a government-wide perspective. It's not category management that's the focus. It's the mission business strategy of the government in this case. You can also apply this in a large organization, right? But again, what we're trying to do is drive a business or a mission strategy down through the procurement strategy in using category management to actually enact that procurement strategy. But again and again, particularly in governments like the UK, you will hear that category management is a delivery methodology for the business strategy, the mission strategy of government. And it's important for us to keep that in mind. Sometimes we lose sight of what we're doing procurement for. And category management as a delivery mechanism is particularly effective in keeping that linkage with the business mission business strategy, with keeping that alignment with organizational objectives and keeping an understanding that what we're trying to do is to achieve a better level of capability, whether it's in product or service, for achieving those goals. Next slide, please. So we've all heard about spend analysis, and spend analysis is the key driver of the formation of categories of spending, obviously, and then the management of them. Without understanding an organization's whole spend picture, it's very difficult to manage that spending, obviously. And without doing spend analysis, it's very difficult to understand and to set up which categories you're going to try to manage, which categories of spending. Important to say here is that you can't manage everything. So even when we're talking about common goods and services, as I said, we're talking about half of government's procurement spending. You have to obviously target within that. So the government has chosen 10 sort of super categories within which spending will be managed. Even within them, though, you have to target further. You can't necessarily manage all the subcategories within a category such as information technology. It's just too big. So we divide it up into the subcategories that we have divided it up into software, hardware, et cetera. And then within those, we still have to focus on areas of spend that we're going to determine that we're going to manage. Why manage spend at all? Well, the whole point here, again, is to buy as one, is to use government's large spending in order to drive better value from the market that it buys from. How do you do that? Well, a key element of that is to standardize on fewer configurations, which reduces your unit cost. It reduces the cost of deploying those things because, you know, obviously if you're deploying one configuration of something, it takes far less than if you're deploying 10, and it's more complicated. It saves on maintenance and it saves on repair costs. Where you see the government doing this, for example, is the laptop desktop strategy, where they set up 5 configurations that they felt were, you know, the 80% solution of what government's needs are. And GSA and OMB are trying to manage within those 5 different configurations. The standardization is a key tool and a key methodology within category management everywhere it's practiced. The whole point being to, again, unpack the total cost of owning these kinds of assets, and then to challenge and shape demand. And that's exactly what you see, again, with the laptop desktop policy, which is to say, look, we now know what it costs us to have more than 5 configurations of many different brands of laptops and desktops across this huge government. So we're saying, no, let's home in on 5. And we're doing that because we're trying to understand and better manage the actual cost of owning them, from the cost of buying them to the cost of deploying them, maintaining them, repairing them, and then to the cost of retiring them. And so that's how one of the ways spend analysis serves as the basis of category management. Next slide, please. Next, thank you. So now we're down looking at the actual tools that category teams use in order to manage their spending categories. And you're going to hear a lot more about this in the webinar that follows this one. But as I told you, market and supplier intelligence is a key element of the Air Force approach, as it is of the UK's approach. The government has got to become smarter. By facing the market, the government's also got to become smarter about what's going on in the market, and particularly what's going on within the suppliers that it buys from, right? So what's this do for us? Well, first off, it ensures that the market can even provide what it is that government seeks. It identifies who the best suppliers are within a market, because government would prefer to be buying from the better suppliers rather than not better suppliers. And that's an important thing to understand. You know, we don't necessarily always look to that ranking of suppliers within a market, but it's something that every buyer should understand. In any market, we do that in our own personal lives. God knows we should do it in the government. The other thing that is important for us to know is that this capability, this approach, requires continuous market supplier intelligence gathering and analysis. That gives us an incredible opening into understanding emerging suppliers and innovative suppliers and new capabilities moving into a market. This is a moment in our government where we are trying very, very hard to infuse innovation by trying to attract new kinds of suppliers into the government market. Well, if we were practicing category management, particularly in the markets in the categories that we aren't calling just common categories, you can practice this in every kind of spending, not just common. If we were doing that, we would have a much better handle on emerging capabilities, on new companies, on startups, on innovation, and we would be better able to infuse it into all of the areas that we're now trying to do that both in the Defense Department predominantly, and also in civilian agencies. This kind of intelligence also helps us lessen the effects of financial problems among suppliers in the market, for example, or reputational problems, such as suppliers that, for example, have very bad labor practices in foreign countries, things like that. Now, government doesn't face that the way that the private sector does, but there are some companies with reputational problems who have popped up in the government market as well. Also helps us manage supply chain risk. Supply chain risk is a huge focus right now, particularly with deep concerns about Chinese-made components in our hardware, for example, our information technology hardware, and our information technology software, for that matter. But in order to manage that, you really need to understand the supply chain, the supply network, and how it functions for all of the different things that you're purchasing. We find ourselves in a moment right now where, in the United States, the small UAV market is dominated completely by UAVs, or little quadcopters and the like, that are assembled with parts from China or assembled or made by Chinese companies. So we have a real problem there, and we are now looking for investors to create new companies, new suppliers, US suppliers for that market. That kind of supply chain risk would have come much more quickly to the fore in a category management based environment. And also, understanding the market and how it functions allows us to adopt sourcing strategies that are the same kind, or the most effective ones that work in a market, rather than trying to impose ours from government and discovering that they don't seem to elicit the best performance. Next slide, please. So we're also looking at the tool of at the way that category teams manage themselves in order to achieve their goals of saving, of increased quality, and supporting government policy. This is sort of the sine qua non of the actual category team. This is their core goals that they're trying to achieve. Next slide. So I just wanted to start with one key tool, which is called strategic sourcing. It is not the same thing as U.S. government strategic sourcing, and it's important to differentiate those two. Category management strategic sourcing is looking, is a tool, one of many, for looking broadly across the entire life cycle of spending that we've been talking about. All right. U.S. strategic sourcing, for some reason, the U.S. government has determined that strategic sourcing is something that's different from the definition of it across the entire rest of the world and across most markets. So just know that that's a differentiation. And when you're talking about category management, know that you're talking about something different. Next slide. So here we're talking about a variety of different levers that you can use in the sourcing space in order to achieve that value, in order to achieve lower total cost of ownership. So you can aggregate your demand. Sure, you can aggregate your demand. You can also disaggregate your demand if you want to open up the number of suppliers in a given category. You can buy directly from the original equipment manufacturers rather than from resellers. That's a big source of saving. Or you could negotiate prices with the OEMs and then determine that your resellers were going to have to use those prices that are based on the entire government demand. You can time your buys. So buy at the end of the model year. We all buy our cars that way if we're smart. Why doesn't the government buy that way as a regular basis? That's strategic sourcing. You are actually looking to have targeted suppliers bid. This is something that we don't think about that much because we are concerned about fairness and the other things that the FAR dictate. But in fact, don't we really want the best suppliers to be bidding on our solicitations? Yes, we do. And buy the way the market buys. Well, again, we were talking about that earlier, but if the market has certain incentives, it's important to deploy those incentives. Next slide. And again, we're talking here about managing demand. We started out talking about that, the point being that by preventing bad buys, or buying it all when possible, that's the fastest way to save money. And that's what we're aiming to do with category management. Go ahead, next slide. Supplier management is another piece of our toolkit. For one thing, we want to strategically manage the biggest suppliers across government, all right? We want to approach them, again, as one entity, not as a million agencies. So doing that means, for example, we collect feedback from all the agencies that use that supplier, one of those strategic suppliers. That's how we measure their performance, not one agency at a time. We seek to have strategic relationships with them and deeper relationships with the best ones. So what we're trying to do is, within this panoply of suppliers, actually manage those suppliers up the chain to become better and better suppliers of us, the government, and we become a better customer of theirs. Next slide. Contract management, again, is done in a similar way, looking at spending across the government. Here we're trying to measure performance the way it's done in the market. We're trying to ensure that all the spending goes through the contracts that have been negotiated using strategic sourcing with the best suppliers. And this is where BICs come in, the best-in-class contracts. The point being, we want to make sure that the spending is going where it has been determined is the best suppliers and in the best ways based on looking at the markets. We want to also get the suppliers' management information. This is another source of data for our category management process. We want to know what they know about us. And we want to do things like try to negotiate so that we can get, for example, increasing levels of performance at no extra cost as we negotiate for cost reductions over time. We want to benchmark our pricing against the market and against other buyers. We want to improve as we can all of our processes so we can drive savings back into our relationships with suppliers. Next. So I've gone through that all very, very quickly. Much of the information you can find more deeply looked at in Buying as One, Category Management's Lessons from the United Kingdom, which is the report I told you about that was published earlier this year. And again, if you want to stick around for the next webinar, you'll hear a lot more about supplier and market intelligence and assessment.
Great information. Thank you, Anne, and thanks everybody who joined us today. We've got another webinar coming up at 12:30 with Anne, which is Supercharged Category Management. Hopefully you guys can join us for that. Thanks again, everybody.